I was so unhappy, lonely, isolated, terrified. I got to a point where I couldn't see a future, and is something that was so shameful I can't talk about it. No amount of guilt will ever change the past. No amount of anxiety can shape the future. I'm not of the belief that had I figured this out, I would have been a better performer. I just think I would have been happier throughout my entire career.
We're brought to you today by Roka. Unlock 20% off your order with the code RICHROLL at roka.com. So happy to have you here, man. Excited to talk to you. You've been on this journey with mental health, with body dysmorphia, with disordered eating, and you made this decision to go public with this struggle and your recovery process. Initially through the documentary that you made with Koros, which I found to be very impactful and courageous, the level at which you were willing to be vulnerable, and I'm sure has been, impactful for a lot of people. So, let's just start there, like laying yourself bare. You know what I mean?
It was terrifying.
Yeah.
I hated it. It's funny, as an athlete and a dreamer, I had always kind of visualized that someday I might make the rounds in media and, be on Good Morning America or sit with you. Mm-hmm. But it would have been after winning UTMB or having some big accolade next to my name.
The perfect set of circumstances.
Yeah. And so that's how I always kind of wrote that story. But I think this is actually more poetic and kind of in line with where I am at, where it kind of is a deep reminder that we're so much more than those accomplishments. And I'm actually really, Lindsay was asking me are you nervous? And I said, no, I'm pretty psyched because for the first time in my life, we're going to have a chat where I don't feel like I'm holding this huge secret.
Right. It's much more stressful if you have to show up and wear this certain mask and answer questions in a certain way that's going to further this image that you're trying to project.
Yeah.
And it's a lot more relaxing when you're like, I have nothing to hide. Ask me anything. And it just, whatever it is, it is.
Yeah. You're not defaulting to those perfectly crafted answers you've preloaded because you know how to dodge questions. And I think it's sort of that act of self-preservation where you're embarrassed or shameful of something. And it's not that you don't want to be honest, but you don't feel that you can.
Right.
So you have this secret life that you're trying to basically hold at the same time as holding up this image. So,
right. And the lock on that cabinet is shame.
Yeah.
Right. And it has such a powerful grip as a motivator to, keep things quiet, keep things private. And the fear that kind of lives behind that drives your life.
Yeah. And I think shame is a very powerful emotion to basically make you, kind of retreat from society. Or relationships.
Sure. You isolate. Shame grows in the dark, and you withdraw from humanity because it's too anxiety ridden to, sort of hold that mask up and be around people. It's exhausting. Yeah. And so you have stepped out into the light.
And I think that was, part of what I've learned in some of these recovery the aspects of recovery is that I have to learn to sit with anxiety and not reduce it. And I think that's part of the body dysmorphia and OCD stuff. There are therapies that treat you like in CBT or others that you want to diminish the anxiety and how do you breathe through it. But in these compulsive disorders, you need to learn to sit with it. Let that anxiety course through your veins and recognize that the fear that's causing you to maybe do these compulsive acts isn't actually there, but that obsession and the compulsion are linked through the anxiety. And so we're not trying to remove the anxiety. We're just basically trying to acknowledge it and tell it to get the hell out of here.
Right. And so the difference being, yes, with compulsive disorders or addictions, there is this unbelievable drive to change your state. It's so uncomfortable to sit with whatever you're experiencing that you will literally do anything to take yourself out of that. And it's on autopilot, right? So whether that's through a substance or a food or withdrawing from people or gambling or some kind of weird, obsessive compulsive behavior, it's all a coping mechanism, a defense strategy to remove you from that discomfort. And recovery is about, as you said, sitting in it and realizing as much, like, because when it comes up, you literally feel like you're going to die, right? It's like life threatening. And to learn that feelings are just feelings. And even though it might feel like it's going to kill you, the one thing you can count on with feelings is that they always change. They never stay the same. And you have to kind of build that muscle over time.
Yeah. And even though, I mean, now I'm 38 and I started therapy when I was 35. I feel like I'm an adult, but sometimes emotionally I feel like I'm still very stunted. And, like I remember first time in therapy, like talking about emotions, like I could name happy, sad, angry, nervous, but then like I got this emotional wheel from my therapist and I don't know, like dozens and dozens and dozens of, descriptors on there. And, just kind of that entire quiver of different emotions, like I just hadn't ever really processed or been able to identify them. And I think what you're saying, that leads to us, if you can't process your emotions, we tend to either harm ourselves or sometimes other people in response to it. And so I think through this, through some of the treatment, I realized that the more I spoke about it, the more I opened up to Lindsay or my family or, that Koros documentary, which was absolutely terrifying to do. Being someone that's afraid of other people's opinions, like that drives a lot of my stuff, like just that fear of being made fun of or ridiculed or not being enough. I think that was a sort of an act of confronting that anxiety demon of being so afraid, but recognizing that I came through it. And not only was I okay, like I probably connected with more people as a result of it.
Sure, of course.
I mean, that one act, I had more responses, like thousands of people reaching out, men, women, people across the spectrum, like either thanking or saying, hey, I deal with these things. And I didn't have the energy to respond to all those people. So like, I felt bad about that. It was like, in my, I guess, athletic life, I've always made it a point to like respond to every DM or comment, and because I just feel grateful that someone's taking notice. But in this one, I didn't have the energy to do that, and so like part of me, but I was able to acknowledge that and let it go, and like, hey, people don't expect a response, and I think because I've been in their shoes where you feel seen or heard if someone else talks, and I think that was what really, in combination with the, hey, this is part of the healing process. I also recognized, if I can make one person feel less alone, then it will all be worth it. Because I am a pretty like genuinely like happy-go-lucky guy and I love life, but I got to a point where I couldn't see a future. And I know that's the case for a lot of people. And you feel isolated, you feel alone, you feel like you're the only person that's ever gone through this, had that thought, sat with that emotion. And I just recognized if my, overcoming this fear that I was building up in my own head is something that was so shameful I can't talk about it, then if that can allow someone else to feel empowered enough to go seek help or talk to a friend or talk to their parents, then it'll all be worth it. And
yeah, and of course it is.
It is.
You are experiencing that. There's this, baked in irony because in the process of making that film, to your point, I'm sure it was terrifying and you're thinking you're going to be judged and all your perfectionism and OCD and the fear around external acceptance and all of that just starts lighting up your brain like crazy. But ultimately, the connection that ultimately you're seeking that is the reason why those maladaptive thought patterns come up is achieved through the vulnerability and the courage to kind of speak your truth. And that's what truly connects people, right?
Yeah.
So it's bizarre. It's like everything inside of you is saying this is the wrong thing to do.
Yeah.
And yet ultimately it solves the underlying problem that those defense mechanisms are trying to protect you, against. It's a very counterintuitive, strange thing.
It's strange. And I think there is a level of, I don't know if the right term for it, but almost like performative vulnerability where that there might be that response. But I have found, because I've engaged in that kind of stuff over the years where, I might say something knowing that like people might feel sorry for me and then they're going to be there to like coddle me. But like something like this, I think I knew it was so uncomfortable. And I knew that I was more in that, if we had that Venn diagram, more on the side of like, this is what I need to be doing. I don't think vulnerability is easy. I think it is hard. And if it's
If it's not hard, you're probably not actually being vulnerable.
That's probably right. Like you're still like
there's
adhering to
performance vulnerability. There's a lot of that out there, right?
Yeah, especially on social media. Like, and figuring out how much to tell of your story, or that. And like everyone, I have I don't know, a challenging relationship with social media, and I perpetuate it because over the years I've carefully curated the image I want to see, and that fed my dysmorphia, where I would check in with what I posted, and then if I'd see myself in the mirror, it wasn't that exact frame that I hand selected, where gravity was like working perfectly to make me like, And then in reality, I'm like, that's, that was a 100th of a second. I was comparing myself against my own thing. So I contributed to all of that negativity that would just spiral in my head.
Right. Well, all the incentives in your world like line up to, kind of make that situation more exacerbated.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think there's something unique about, first of all, like being an athlete and suffering from this, because you have to be competitive and you have to show up with your game face. And there is some masking that goes into how to be competitive and on the edge that you want and need to be amongst the elites. But then on top of that, the bigger issue being that you're male. And I think the conversation around eating disorders and these types of compulsions with women is much further, down the line. Like there's not as much sort of shame and hiding in the conversation around how this impacts women and girls than it is with men. And I really think that's a big reason why I think it's so important what you're doing, because I think this is something that is massive and hidden among men. And you can see it beneath and behind so much of the diet tribalism and the nutrition wars that we see on social media, which, I'm not immune from that as this like plant-based person, of course. But whether it's like vegan, keto, low carb, intermittent fasting, time-restricted eating, like all of these approaches in the kind of manosphere are shrouded in language around optimization and performance. But in reality, I think behind that, for a lot of people, it's about weight loss, weight management. It's about body image. And it's a way for men to kind of hide that they're suffering from a version of what you have endured, while looking outwards to the world as if they're like a biohacker or something like that. When in truth, there's a lot of insecurity and shame and guilt. Because just like women, men go on Instagram and they see all these guys with idealized, figures, and most people don't look like that. And even the people that do look like that probably only look like that temporarily or with the right filter and lighting and all the rest.
Yeah, indeed. Agreed. Yeah. It's, I think I'm hoping this is a generational thing that we start to see kind of dissipate, but there is that notion of boys don't cry. And I definitely, I wasn't explicitly raised that way, but I think, people I was around, like friends and like, it's kind of, the undercurrent that you notice. And I don't think I really had honest conversations with anyone close to me until I was probably in my 30s. It's just kind of internalized things. And I view
about anything you mean in general, like just the emotional, you being in touch with your emotions and the truth of who you are.
Yeah. And I think a lot of that is I don't know where it began, but I always thought that, maybe that was a weakness. Like somehow I connected those dots and like, I was going to just be tough. I was going to bury it, swallow it. I could grit through anything. And, I unfortunately do that with injuries also, where I still get afraid of telling Mario I'm hurt, my coach. And, should be that should be easy now. Like I've been doing this for 20 years, but like, I almost view like getting injured as a weakness, or it's an inadequacy. And I'm afraid to tell people that. And I think with emotional stuff, it was similar. I just, internalized everything. And the more you internalize things, the more that echo chamber gets deeper and deeper inside your own head. And as you said earlier, shame and all these other, like emotions that we don't want to take root, they just feed in that darkness. And I think that unless you give voice to these things, it's easier for it to kind of, the ruminations to kind of take really deep root. And it's hard to then dig those out.
I want to do a little what it was like, what happened, and what it's like now in the parlance of recovery. But I think it would be helpful to first kind of define what we're talking about. When you say body dysmorphia or eating disorder or OCD, like what are you saying specifically? Like how do you define those phrases and words?
I think it's also important, and I'm sure you have a really astute and intelligent audience. Like I have a graduate degree in my own experience,
Yeah.
and I'm a licensed physical therapist, and a pro runner, but I am not a psychologist. So like I can speak from my N of one.
But that's what we do in recovery anyway,
it's
right?
true.
Like we're here to share our experience. We're not here to provide medical advice.
Yeah, true. And I think especially with the eating disorder stuff, it's a fascinating illness. There are a lot of different kind of branches of it, but in general, it's a competitive disorder. So I've even found myself that I listen to other people's recovery stories, or they, kind of recount what happened, and my brain latches on to like trying to find hacks of how to like double down on what I'm dealing with. And so I try to be very careful with the way I describe things and not romanticize aspects too much, because unfortunately that is kind of true to that disorder. And it's really interesting that it, of all mental illnesses, like especially anorexia nervosa, has the highest mortality rate of any mental illness, like even more than depression, which
wow.
That's really powerful to think that, it's like, because, and as you said earlier, we all have issues with food, so it's kind of like, hey, like, oh yeah, I count my calories, or, I'm afraid of overeating, or like that Thanksgiving dinner did me in, I, unbuttoned my belt, and, and so those are normal. But I think with any disorder, it's when it becomes debilitating, intrusive, all encompassing, and it creates so much anxiety, you can't get away from it. But so I guess from my experience, like eating disorders, like I've kind of, I don't know, tried on different hats in the eating disorder, in the fashion show of eating disorders.
Yeah.
Like I had a bout in college where I was dealing with anorexia. I'm now actually clinically diagnosed with OSFED, which is other specified feeding and eating disorders, because the big three, the big three are anorexia nervosa, bulimia nervosa, and then binge eating. Those are kind of like the three big guys. Like people have heard of those. But I think what clinicians found is that the diagnostic criterion in the DSM-5 is so specific to meet that classification. It was leaving a lot of people that were suffering out. And then you can't get access to healthcare, if you don't have an adequate diagnosis.
But
so
like to say disordered eating is sort of a catch-all umbrella for anything else that might fall between the cracks.
Yeah, because I think eating disorder versus disordered eating is like maybe this is a bad analogy.
A clinical diagnosis versus something's fucked up over here, but we just don't have a name for it.
Yeah. So and maybe this is a bad analogy, but like a binge drinker versus an alcoholic. Like, okay, I went on a bender and like I displayed some of these behaviors, but you can choose to stop. You can like go on with your life. The alcoholic can't. So I maybe there's some sort of parallel there, but
no,
like
I get that.
With someone suffering from an eating disorder, like an anorexic, it's not that they don't want to eat or they know they can't eat, but there's something like in their brain that's like basically gone haywire that they aren't able to, and even as they deteriorate. But I and through my experience in the medical model, like I'm thankful that my therapist knew how to, not game the system, but like treat it appropriately. Where like I was probably going to get denied because I didn't fit one of those, three big ones. And for all intents and purposes, I'm a healthy white male, a pro athlete.
Yeah, you're not like
I don't fit the bill of like
you're not stumbling in at 85 pounds with your hair falling out.
Yeah. So why would an insurance want to pay for my eating disorder treatments? So I think that's a bit of the disordered eating. I think everyone probably experiences disordered eating at some point. And as you said, the fad diets that promotes a lot of disordered eating behaviors. I think though, if you have someone that's predisposed to developing an actual eating disorder, that's where those fad diets are dangerous.
Right, because you can just hide behind it.
Yeah,
And
it's like, I'm intermittent fasting for 22 hours a day.
Right. Actually, you're just not eating.
You're just not eating. Like,
you're not eating, and you're doing it out in public in a way where nobody can say anything.
Yeah.
But in reality, what is actually going on here? Right.
Yeah.
Right. And so how does OCD and other kind of compulsive disorders, perfectionism, people pleasing, all of that, like how do these things, because it's all a soup, right? And on some level, it's the longer I've been doing this and the longer I've kind of been in this world, like it all feels like the same thing. It just shows up in different ways, whether you're a heroin addict or an alcoholic or a gambling addict or a love addict. There's something inside of you, something happened to you, or you're wired in a certain way where you feel not at ease with yourself and you don't like how you show up in the world. And it's so uncomfortable that you develop these little things that you do to make you feel safe and okay. And often they're about trying to regain or exercise some level of control in a situation in which you feel out of control, and food, plays a big part in that. But really, it's rooted in a sense of feeling different than everyone else, of being insecure, like you don't measure up, and you in and of yourself are not okay.
Yeah.
So how does that work? And like, how do those other kind of, like, what is the OCD piece and the people pleasing and the perfectionism aspect of all of this?
OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, body dysmorphic disorder I think it's classified as an obsessive compulsive related disorder. So they're like two separate things, but they're kind of in that soup of compulsive behaviors. And from my understanding, the big difference is they share the same basically obsessions, compulsions linked with anxiety, but body dysmorphic disorder is directly linked just to your body, where OCD has like very kind of clear pathways of like harm OCD or, germ OCD or just right OCD, all these like, religious OCD, they fall into these little categories. And like body dysmorphia is almost like, it's just the body OCD.
Right. I see. I got it. So whether you're, checking the lock on your door 10 times or, however that shows up, it's a stress reducing, anxiety reducing kind of behavior.
So for like the body dysmorphic sufferer, they may be checking themselves in the mirror, which we all do, but are you checking yourself in the mirror for hours a day? Like, is it impeding your ability to go to work? Are you looking at every reflective surface? Did you know you can see your reflection in a spoon? And obviously a spoon is also, concave or convex, so it's going to like distort it even more. But God, you will see yourself in a non-flattering way and think that's real. And so I found that anything that was reflective became basically an area that I could reduce the anxiety. But the more you engage in those compulsions, the stronger the link becomes. And it just like self-perpetuates. And it gets to the point where you don't trust yourself if you don't do the compulsion, because the obsession is so, it's so invasive and debilitating and unwelcomed that you feel like you have to do the compulsion to reassure yourself that it's okay. Is that, checking the lock over and over, or washing my hands. Are my hands actually dirty? And so with body dysmorphia, it could be checking, it could be, fidgeting with your hair, your glasses, making sure things are just right, because your fear of maybe that rejection or the fear of other people judging you. And I don't know, I think like in my family, like we have a pretty extensive history of alcoholism. And so to what you said, like, I think there are a lot of similarities between all these things. It's like, and the funny thing is like—
It's the same thing that you just found a different way of expressing.
And I mean, it's kind of funny, like so I've had a really, really difficult relationship with food for a lot of reasons. But like, I basically like did suffer from bouts of extreme binging. Again, I didn't fall into binge eating disorder criteria because I also compulsively exercised to like undo the binging. So like I kept the balances, weighted correctly. But there was a point where I'd see my friends at parties drink and they never ate. So I thought, why don't I just drink instead of eat? Like maybe that can replace, and ultimately I just end up drinking and eating, which is like double the calories. And it's like, okay, I'm going to add another 10 miles tomorrow on my run. Like, so it's like, I'm very thankful that for whatever reason, despite our familial history, like I didn't seem to have the the gene that latched onto the alcohol. Like, because I was raised with that awareness that like,
Right.
don't touch alcohol. Like, it's a really bad thing for our family. Like, you should not go close to it. And so like the first time I took a drink of alcohol, I think it was my sophomore year of college. And I was terrified. Like, I asked my friends, like, what's going to happen when this touches my lips? You know, like, and I was just like,
brew.
I was so scared. And I think, but I don't know, like, so there definitely is a component of just that like overall anxiety, you know, around a lot of things.
Yeah.
But like with my compulsions, I have a hard time remembering some things about like my childhood or my life, and that's probably pretty normal. And I think what I've realized is over the last, 10 or 15 years, when I was really just like suffocating in my own thoughts, there wasn't room to entertain the past, of experiences that were positive or amazing, like, because I've had a great life. But I think I just got so focused on trying to get through the day or that moment. All I could think about was numbers and food and my body and these different, compulsory checks that I would perform. But I guess I first started to kind of notice this when I was a kid. Like I had kind of I had like a challenging or troubling experience at like a church camp growing up. And like, I must have been 8 or 9. Yeah, I must have been 8 or 9. And my mom, I was raised very religious. And like we were sent away to a boys' camp, to learn how to, let's just say, hunt fish, tie knots, all that fun stuff. And my mom was pretty nervous because like I'm 8 or 9. She's like, oh, he's too young. And all of her church lady friends were like, no, this is great. Like we'll send all the kids, all the boys are together. And so, they send me to upstate Minnesota. That's where I grew up. And, it was a great experience. We got to do all that stuff. But it just so happened that like our counselor, he was this recovering addict. And I think he was 6 months sober, and he was a born again Christian. He had found God, and he wanted to basically just share it with everybody. Like he had to profess what he had learned, and he wanted to share it with everyone. And someone thought it was good for him to be in charge of 8 and 9-year-old, boys at a church camp. And one thing with that experience was he was big on the book of Revelations. And I don't know, have you ever read Revelations?
I can't remember the last time that I did. I know the story.
Yeah.
I think I know enough about
it's about end of
fire
times,
and
basically. Yeah, so it's like a Stephen King novel to an 8-year-old.
The end of times.
Yeah, and basically like really instilled in us that like unless you're a good person, you lead a perfect life, and unless you also like ask for Jesus to come into your heart, you will go to hell and you'll burn forever. And that was like I definitely had a hard time with that. And I think I end up to this day, like my mom will it'll bring her to tears on this, but like I wrote her a postcard from camp that said, and I didn't send it, I tucked it in my bag and she found it a long time later, but it said something like I don't want to die here. Please come get me. Like I'm having these thoughts again.
Oh my God.
And I don't know what that last sentence was, but like, I may have already been dealing with some sort of intrusive thought, but this basically like definitely kind of kicked it into high gear. And following that experience, like she tells that like the story that I then was really afraid of everything. Like everything was going to kill me. Like I wore cleaning gloves, goggles, and walked around with a Kleenex like spray bottle, just like disinfecting everything, because I was afraid that if I got germs inside, I would die. And then if I hadn't already asking for forgiveness for that one thing I just did, I'd end up in hell.
Eternal damnation.
And so reflecting on all this, and I guess, it led to compulsively praying and asking for forgiveness, basically with everything. Like, am I a good person? Did I do that right? Am I perfect? Because I was learning that love was conditional and that it was dependent on basically, something else granting me that. And I'm not here to say those are, like beliefs that shouldn't be taught, but in my personal experience, maybe it wasn't the right time or the right place or the right person to like really instill these things. And that was my first experience with a psychologist. My parents took me to a child psych, and And again, I don't know why this is, because I'm sure they never said anything, but like I was terrified of going. Like something in my head told me this is not normal. Like you're broken. And I, had a huge tantrum, begged them not to tell my siblings that I had gone to a therapist. Like something in me at that age knew that wasn't right, and I don't know where that came from, but the psychologist, from what my mom describes, like said, you just have a really smart boy. Like he's really in tune to his surroundings. He's struggling with the home environment. My parents were going through a separation. Like I had a hard time with that, but he said, it's going to find its way through. And as far as I know, like I didn't really have any lasting issues from like those compulsory things, and I didn't actively try to get rid of it. It just kind of disappeared. But that was my first experience with kind of that stuff.
Wow, that's so interesting. I mean, there's so much to unpack there. I mean, basically, you survived a trauma and you found these coping mechanisms that I don't know that you outgrew. They just became latent and found their way, to different paths that, kind of, and they served you. Like they allowed you to survive and excel as an athlete and all these other areas. I recently had this guy, Richard Schwartzen, who's got this modality called internal family systems, which is super interesting. It's the basic idea is we're not one personality. We're the composite of all different kinds of personalities that are, acting up and vying for attention. And when something like OCD or a fear response happens, that's one piece of your personality that was constructed specifically to protect you in a certain set of circumstances. And it works. It does protect you. But then you grow up and you're not 5 years old or 8 or 9 or 10, and it's not serving you anymore, but it's still just as powerful because it thinks that you're 9 years old and you're still at camp, right? Yeah. And making peace with that and trying to quell it and be like, it's cool, I'm good now, thank you. I don't really need you anymore, but I appreciate all the hard work that you've done for me.
Yeah.
It's like this process of understanding all of those different triggers and aspects of your personality to reconstruct, a healthier one for yourself. And as you were sharing that, I was thinking about that. And also just the idea that, first of all, credit to your parents. They realized that you needed some help and sought out help, which is great. But you being so young and pathologizing that and that just exacerbating your sense of being broken probably wasn't great.
Yeah. And that's it. Like my parents are amazing. I feel like I had the best parents ever, provided a loving household, always reassured us that, we were welcomed, accepted. And so it's weird that suddenly some of these things I deal with, it's oh, well, obviously it probably came from just your immediate inner circle. You were, whatever, something happened in that relationship breakdown. Yeah.
But it's not about vilifying them or anything. Just because something might have happened and maybe it wasn't managed or dealt with, in the best way possible, doesn't mean that they're bad parents or not good people.
Yeah.
They were doing the best that they could under the circumstances, but it doesn't undercut the fact that certainly, something happened or a set of things happened that, set you on a path to, kind of everything that happened and where you are now.
And I think probably this, again, is a generational thing. Each generation tries to provide a better household and experience for their kids. Because my parents had what I would label as traumatic childhoods, whereas I had it bougie. It was chill.
Yeah.
But there are just things that happen, and I think with I don't know, and maybe it's a bit of a cultural thing, but it's that Minnesota nice, Lutheran Norwegian. You show up on Sunday with a hot dish and a smile, and everything's always good.
Right.
It's so I don't think I ever, and I know I never really started to talk about things that happened, and then at different stages in life, like you said, okay, maybe it kind of disappeared, and then it resurfaced in experiences with bowling, or then it resurfaced in my competitive running, once I got to college, and that's where suddenly the eating disorder surfaced up and dealt with other things. So I think it was that the fact that I never truly processed or, kind of even teased out what was happening, it was just lurking under the surface for something else to trigger it off.
We're brought to you today by Roka. Glasses are not something you normally think about as a piece of performance gear, which, when you think about it, is kind of insane because you can't perform at your best if you can't see. Well, the geniuses at Roka basically rebuilt eyewear from the ground up. No matter how active you are or how much you sweat, these things never slip or fall off your face. They're super durable, they look awesome, and they've got tons of super classy modern styles to choose from. I've been rocking Rokas for about 4 years at this point. I love them. I'm a big fan of the Hamilton style in gloss black. That's this frame right here, as well as clear, or I guess they call them vintage on the website. And if you want to try them out for yourself, you can do that right now and unlock 20% off your order with the code RICHROLL at roka.com. Or you can click the link in the description below. Okay, back to the show. You had mentioned earlier, like, you were lucky that, alcoholism runs in your family, but you sidestep that. But with alcoholism, you stop drinking and then you're on a path to sobriety. Like, you set it down and you don't have to contend with it anymore. Whereas food, you have to eat every day. So it haunts you forever. Yeah. It's like looming over you all the time, which I actually think makes it more difficult. And then on top of that, all of these traits that over time metastasize to become problematic enough to address, in the meantime, help construct a personality, a lens on the world, that fuel exceptionalism, success, and results. So while you're in that buildup, you're winning races, you're getting better as a runner, you're a professional, you're doing all of these things. Quietly, these things are your superpowers. So your relationship to them, even if you know in your heart of hearts, like, this is not good, I shouldn't be doing this, but like, look what's happening. And I'm on these podiums and this, so I'm going to keep doing this. And this is like working for me. Makes it even more difficult when you have to break up with them because they are your best friends.
There are times that I have been at my sickest and podiumed at UTMB. And so it's really hard to decouple those two.
Right. If you do break up with them, then no more podiums.
Yeah. That's what your brain tells you. When in reality, it was a coincidence, or it was, it wasn't causation that because I held on to these certain things that happened, that then I podiumed. Arguably, you probably could have done better if you weren't dealing with all these other things, But I do agree with you. I think that something like obsessive compulsive disorders, it is a bit of a superpower in the sense that, like, it's really hard to manage living in your own head when it's basically you're dealing with intrusive, suffocating thoughts, and you learn a lot of resiliency, endurance, patience, which, I mean, you need that in an ultra, right? Yeah. Like, so there are times where it's like, I almost feel thankful for, I feel thankful for those, like, the skills that were developed. I wish they had developed in a different way, and because I think the more I learn about even sports psych, you can start to nurture those skill sets through much healthier outlets. It doesn't have to be pathological.
But it doesn't create the same kind of hormonal brain spike. It's very unfamiliar and feels not right? Yeah. Like it's like, no, I need to feel like I'm in pain or suffering, or in this sort of, I have to conjure up a certain kind of state that I can manufacture through these behaviors to do it in the more graceful way that requires a surrender and a letting go and more of an allowing. Feels like, walking on Mars compared to a lifetime of a certain way of doing things where you're getting the result that you're seeking.
And you definitely, like, anyone that's run before, the more you run, the better you get. And there's that direct correlation for a long time. Okay, I'm going to put in more, I get more out. Now, obviously, there are tipping points and, roadblocks that happen, but you start linking that and it becomes so strong that you can't imagine performing without doing the things that got you there. And I think there is that, like, just being stubborn is a really good asset until it isn't.
Right.
Like,
right. It's a short-term strategy. It will get you to a certain point, but if you want to have longevity or reach that, kind of get off that plateau and get to the next level, what got you there isn't the thing that's going to get you to the next place. And there's a discomfort with that. And then on top of it, being a runner, And with the food piece, it's a weight weenie sport. Like, the lightweight chassis is going to navigate those mountains a little bit more gracefully, right? So for any athlete who's in a sport like that, whether it's wrestling, running, ultra running, cycling, triathlon, where there's a power to weight thing, or even more aesthetic sports like bodybuilding, it's just they're just rife environments for kind of cultivating these unhealthy relationships with what we put in our mouth.
Totally. And I think that we're starting to see conversations change on that, which I love, because when I was growing up in high school and college, it was the era of either explicitly saying you should look emaciated, or it was implied, from some of the cult classic books and other things that like I would, just, ingest, and, what people on the team would talk about, and, your peers, or rumors, a lot of that, or you'd see people, but it's, I think you have to acknowledge that weight is a variable in running. And as you said, like, okay, like you can just do the simple physics on this. However, it's a low-hanging fruit that we latch onto because we can manipulate weight pretty quickly. So we think, if I'm this powerful or stronger and like have that much endurance, and if I just weigh less, I will perform X better. And that just isn't the truth, because there are a lot of other variables that go into it. And I think it's easy for anyone to look at one of their running idols, because I did this, and you forget that they may have been training their body for 10, 20, 30 years to adapt into that specific like body type. It didn't just happen overnight. And there are genetic, anomalies out there where someone is just like, they don't have to manipulate their body and they're going to have this particular frame. Like I have very broad shoulders. Lindsay and I joke that I have birthing hips. Like I will never fit.
For a runner.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm looking at you. You're a pretty slight dude.
Yeah.
And it's just, that's the dysmorphic
but like I'll never fit into
too.
like, oh, it definitely
just
is.
You thinking like I'm too big to be a runner, and I'm looking at you and I'm like, you have a runner's physique.
Yeah. And which the crazy thing is, like at my worst, when I was battling with anorexia in college, I was almost 35 pounds less than I am right now, which I don't like. I can acknowledge my brain still says you have 35 pounds you could lose, but I know that's not true. Like I can just like start to acknowledge that and move on. But like in college, like I don't have 35 pounds to lose. Like, and it became a point where my teammates, they were worried and bringing it up. And then you go into that defensive, angry method of like, I got everything fine. Like, why are you accusing me? And, it's just that immediate, kind of, self-preservation.
When you were 35 pounds lighter, in addition to just the training and the mileage, like what was a day in food for you then? Like, what did it look like?
I was restricting an incredible amount while training very heavily for a distance runner. Because I just had this very arbitrary and reduced thought that I should always be consuming less than 2,000 calories a day, even if I'm running 90 to 100 miles a week. And so over time, you build up a huge deficit where your body starts to cannibalize itself, because you need nutrients to fuel normal brain function, hormones, your bone density, all these things. But you're like, great, cannibalize away because I'm trying to get smaller. Yep. I mean, and I hate to say this, but probably the highest high I've ever had is that euphoric feeling of like feeling like my bones or clothes hanging off of me, or seeing the number on the scale. Like that was like, it's the needle in the arm. It's better than standing on the top of UTMB's podium. Like, which is a weird, really strange thing to say. But I also know at the same moment, I was so unhappy, lonely, isolated, like terrified. So I would never want to go back to that. But it was something that was powerful. And what was your level of self-awareness around, the disease or disorder aspect of what you were doing? Because I just know from my own experience, it's like, this isn't right or good. Yeah. You just kind of push that down and you're like, it's fine. I got this. I'm under control. It'll be cool. I definitely knew I think when you engage in certain behaviors where like you immediately have shame around what you just did, like, and you wouldn't be able to tell a friend what you just engaged with,
Mhm.
I think you know that you're doing something that's not right. Like
Right.
if you couldn't tell your grandmother that you were just like eating out of the trash or like whatever you just did, like, some sort of, purging behavior, like
Mhm.
that's not okay.
Right.
And I think that's where like probably the components that I built as an adolescent of like really being hyper cognizant of my appearance and of the way I carry myself, everything from my voice to my hair to my, you know, my posture, all these things. Like I was just hyper cognizant of being judged. I think that led into, okay, now I'm an athlete and I see all these other
Mhm.
athletes and it's a very reduced view. You see athlete X perform and you think it's because they look a certain way. And again,
Mhm.
you don't know what the training was that went into that. You don't know their individual biological differences. And what I noticed was I was very fortunate. Like I was never the best or even close to the best runner in high school, college, even pros, like as a marathoner. But I had opportunities because I had friends with really fast people to like get into these training groups like in Mammoth
Mhm.
and like run and do easy runs for Meb, like and do long runs with him. But like my brain's comparing me with Meb. Like
Mhm.
that's not a fair comparison.
Right.
Like that's just not like
Yeah.
that should have never happened.
Right. I mean, just to
But like
kind of drop into Mammoth,
yeah,
like if comparison is the thief of joy, like you're in an environment where, that comparison that you're running in your mind is going to drive you insane
oh yeah,
because
I was broke.
you're amongst
Stole all
like,
my
yeah,
joy. Like
and was Ryan Hall still, doing his marathon thing
So-
at that time? Like, cause he was like, I mean, he got so lean or
Yeah.
whatever to the point, and then whether he overtrained or, whatever
Yeah.
was going on at that point. I mean, now he's a completely different human being, but at that time, it looks like he kind of took that all the way to the wall.
he definitely I think he would say he got everything he
Mhm.
could out of himself. He had transitioned out of Mammoth right when I got there. Like Lindsay and I moved there in 2011 for an internship at the hospital as for my therapy.
Yeah.
And at that point, Terrence, the coach, he was still in charge of the Mammoth Track Club. Ryan and Sarah had just left, but like Sarah came back and I did some training with her.
Mhm.
But like it was Meb, Dina, Morgan Usini, and Anna Willard or Anna Pierce, and so it was kind of track heavily focused with a few really stud marathoners like Dina
Right.
and Meb.
Right.
Yeah.
I've had conversations on this podcast with Amelia Boone about her, analogous adventures in this world of like struggling with relationship to food. I had Mary Kane in here, and certainly there's no shortage of running institutions, especially when women and girls are involved, where the powers that be are kind of issuing an edict of not so healthy, dynamics around food that have led to, a lot of problems. And there's been a lot of spotlights, shown on that world. But what does that look like when you're a male athlete? Do you have coaches that are saying you need to drop weight, or what is the, kind of the power dynamic when you're underneath somebody who's guiding your career and the kind of ripple effect on your relationship with food?
I was very fortunate that my coaches never had those conversations in terms of like, we need to manipulate things.
It doesn't seem to be a thing with guys.
No. And I mean, to my coach's credit in college, like Gary, he pulled me aside and said, I'm worried about you. Like, are you eating enough? Like, and so he noticed something was happening. I think in the back, that was 2006, it was quite a while ago now. I think at that time, it was much more taboo. He had he recognized it, but I don't know if he knew what to do with it.
Mm-hmm.
Where I think now we have much better systems in place where it's like, okay, like let's get you in touch with our school nutritionist or the school psych, or let's talk to the GP. And I think those types of things have improved a lot because as a coach, you're kind of like the gatekeeper. Like you're not the expert of everything, but you are dealing with the athlete the most. So you should be able to acknowledge and then pass an athlete off to someone that needs that expertise.
Mm-hmm.
And as you said, like in the worst case scenarios, like with a Mary Kane or NOP, you had bad actors playing roles they shouldn't have been playing under the guise of I'm guiding this career. And that's tragic. Like that's really a horrible situation. And I think the more things are talked about, we can start to undo some of that negative, those negative pathways. And then also the destigmatizing that like, okay, like it's not a male thing. Cause I'm sure there are plenty of men in all those sports you listed that have had some sort of experience or at least thoughts on this stuff. And then worst case, and that goes back to what you said at the very beginning, and I was talking to another pro marathoner about this, like, there are people in sports that like engage in disordered behavior for a season, because they're like, hey, my nutritionist or someone in my medical team says I do need to cut weight for this boxing match. Like, and so that stuff happens, and it could technically be done like with proper guidance, but the addict or the person that actually suffering, they can't turn it off when it's over. Like, and so it will just continue. It'll keep going despite the season being over, and it doesn't end until, something intervenes or like, you hit your proverbial rock bottom.
Yeah.
Like,
and I think that lives on a spectrum. It's not a light switch, right?
No.
Like right now, I've got a lower back condition. It's really got me benched, and I can't move the way that I would like. And I haven't been able to run. I've just been way more sedentary than I have in a long time. And so put on a little weight, little flabby, looking in the mirror, that's not really how I want to look. And, I can feel myself like, how does that impact first of all, then I don't feel as good in the world, and I don't feel like myself, and my brain doesn't work. And that alters my relationship with food in a way, and I'll avoid, like some of that's fine and perfectly healthy. And some of it I can feel myself being a little compulsive about. Like I wouldn't consider myself to have an eating disorder, but I noticed that, compulsive kind of obsessive tickle on the back of the brain, And it was weird. We were talking, I was at this Strava event yesterday. There's all these super fit people, it's just like, and like, everyone's looking at me. Oh, you're the guy with the pod. It's like, and I'm like, yeah, but I'm kind of like, and I go through all of that, like insecurity, and I want to acquit myself and be the guy. Like, 'cause people are projecting onto me because they think they have a relationship with me because they've listened to the podcast or whatever, and all of that is spinning in my head. And it's like, it's really hard to just get quiet and realize, like, no one gives a shit. Like, you're cool. Like, everyone's happy you're here. It's fine.
And I think
you don't have to go on the group run in the morning and like, be in the lead pack and all of that. Like, but that's what's looping. And I've heard you say, like, you're not worried about racing against the best at UTMB and how long you're going to be out there and the suffering and how hard it's going to be. You're freaked out about the fun run 2 days ahead of time.
Yeah.
Right?
It's a really strange thing to, like, it's almost like a both and. I know I'm a competent and accomplished runner, but at the same time, I don't think I'm worthy of being called a runner or showing up in the world with people because I didn't feel thin enough or I didn't, like, it was terrifying.
So if someone says to you, congrats, or like, wow, what you've done is amazing. Like, do you kind of contract and feel unworthy of receiving nice things being said about you?
Yes. And maybe a good example is in 2017, arguably probably the best race of my career.
That's when you got third at UTMB.
Yeah,
right?
shared the podium with Francois.
You were under 20 hours.
Yep.
Yeah.
With Francois and Killian. Like, the moment, like, approaching the finish line, like, it was pure joy. Like, I'd just done something I dreamt of. Like, I had, like, silenced the haters and the voices in my head. I just, like, was triumphant. But the half-life of that happiness didn't even make it to the podium the next day. Like, that next morning, I hopped on a bike and I was like trying to spin out my legs. I showed up, and thankfully, like, we had podium jackets that I could wear, but jackets are shells that I would always cover my body in. So I wore pants and jacket on a hot day, staying on the podium, like, super uncomfortable, but like afraid of what people might think of me. 12 hours ago, I had just run one of the best races like ever at UTMB, but it didn't last. Like, and it seemed like the more I got into my career, especially the last couple of years, like, that happiness half-life got shorter and shorter and shorter and shorter. Like, or it needed more and more to, like, trigger something as being worthy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the insanity of that, right?
And I say it, and it's like,
yeah, I know.
like,
And even more like for people who are trying to wrap their heads around
Yeah.
like how, like just to inhabit the mind, the insane mind of this, you've talked about one of the reasons why you like UTMB and you would dismiss Western states, it's not technical and blah, blah, blah. But the real reason you liked UTMB is that you start in the dark and you got a good 12 hours of hiding in darkness to sweat enough to drop a little bit of weight so that by the time people actually see you, you feel like you look the way you would like to look.
Yeah.
And that is like, that encapsulates like everything you need to know about the insanity of this disorder.
And because I literally see myself as overweight. Like, even though we might have objective augmented feedback that says otherwise, like, I would see myself differently. So like, but once I cross that threshold of exercising enough, something flips in my brain and I start to feel that, okay, the scales are balancing appropriately. And it's just pretty unfortunate that you have to go to those lengths to achieve that, and then it doesn't last. Like,
and then that with the half-life shrinking or your inability to like be present and experience joy at your own accomplishments is a situation in which you can make peace with that, because your job isn't to be joyful and happy. Your job is to perform, right? And if this set of behaviors gets you on a podium, even if it doesn't produce joy, that's a deal you're willing to make, because you need to excel, because love is conditional and you can't get that love unless you do these things out in the world. And whether you're able to experience that or not for yourself is almost beside the point or irrelevant.
I think that's well encompassed.
So where does it, I mean, obviously there's a percolating awareness like that you're doing things that you're not proud of or not willing to kind of share with other people. And I would suspect it's building. There's a pressure cooker aspect to it. But where does it start to really flare up in a way where you realize, like, at some point, maybe soon, I'm going to need to address this as you're kind of careening off the edge or nearing your bottom?
I probably really started to notice some like cracks, like in that exterior shell that I like, because I held everything together really well, and I think there was almost like a pride aspect of that.
But that's like, part of it too, the control.
Definitely, like, and that's all the reassurance seeking behaviors of like a compulsive disorder is trying to establish and insert control. Like, how do I know I didn't eat too much? I'm going to count. Like, how do I know that wasn't too much? I'm going to weigh that. How, whatever it like, and so I started to see it really. I think part of it was Lindsay went back to school in about, it must have been right around that like UTMB 2017 or so. Like, so we lived apart for about 18 months and she was away at school. And I think, I started to realize how much I relied on her for, some grounding and some stability. And for a long time in our relationship, I felt like I was the rock, I helped her get through things, and probably at the expense of my ability to share anything. So when I started to talk to her about things, it was a bit of a shock. Like, she always knew there were some things going on, but not the extent of what was happening. And because I could internalize it that well. And, but I think starting to see how much it was impacting our relationship was a bit of that like big crack in the, in the vase, where it's like seeing that my actions and, the things that I thought I had under control are hurting other people. I think that was a big turning point. And then when she left for school, it was also like, I think that was probably the first time in my life that I maybe like, kind of dabbled into the depressive state where, again, I'm a pretty happy person. Like, even though I dealt with all this stuff, it felt like I still liked life. But like when she was gone, I think I started to feel more isolated and lonely. And I think probably a combination of seeing how much some things I was doing was impacting her and hurting, and then like scaring myself that I was having a hard time seeing, a future. Like, if you wake up, or I would wake up at 5 a.m., 6 a.m., and just be terrified of getting out of bed because the thoughts would already have just crashed on me. And I knew the moment I went downstairs, I was going to kind of like numb those thoughts with food. And then by 6 a.m., I would have consumed all the calories I need for a day. And then I know I have to somehow survive the next 14 hours in the world, knowing I can't eat because I've eaten too much. It was just like a life of terror.
Yes,
like,
and it's exhausting.
It's exhausting. And as what you said earlier, I think is fascinating where, if you think about communities historically from beginning of time, like we come together around food. Food's an amazing thing. And you can't live without it. You have to have it. That sustenance feeds us, fuels us, allows us to grow. But there are times where food felt like it was this enemy and I couldn't be trusted around it. You go into a grocery store and it's like, I don't know, the pharmacist just gave you the keys and he left. And he's like, go have at it.
Yeah.
And again, this also comes from a place of privilege where like, I have the ability to purchase what I want. So like, I'm not in a starved state. I'm not in a true deprived state. Like for some reason, my brain's making me do these things, but that's kind of just what I was living in. So I think it was day to day struggling to get through where you just want tomorrow to come. Like you can't wait for tomorrow. And when you're living in that like state of you just want the next day, you're not living. You're not ever present. You're missing out on life. And I think there was a degree of that where it's like, hey, you maybe you don't have it as put together as you thought you did. And this isn't a way to live. And that's where, I mean, in that Chorus film, I'm really thankful Chorus chose to support that film. I had approached some other sponsors and they weren't as interested, but Chorus thought it was a powerful thing to talk about. And so I'm very thankful to Chorus for that. Essentially, it was like, you're not okay anymore. Like something needs to give. And it's not a fault to ask for help. And I think I was still latched onto that. Like, I can just tough through this. Like, I can do anything. Like, it's
right, because self-will is in your arsenal of superpowers because you don't achieve excellence as a marathoner or an athlete in any field if you're not somebody who has the capacity to deploy your self-will to procure a certain result. So why shouldn't that thing that I'm so good at, why can't that should be able to solve this problem? I'll just redirect it here and we'll take care of it. And you have to go through the journey of trying that until you realize that it's just making the whole thing worse. And meanwhile, that I want to talk a little bit more about that journey from denial to acceptance and understanding that your behavior, because the thing is you covet this behavior and you're like, it's not harming anyone else. I'm just going to do this, like, fuck off, know? But then realizing it is impacting others negatively. Like, what do you mean by that when your wife when you started to realize that it was having a negative impact on her?
The first time I really noticed it was actually when I was in grad school. So this would have been like 2009, 2010. Like, Lindsay is a saint. She's always been very financially like insecure. Like, she's worried about finances. Like that's kind of like it scares her. And I think that, so as I was going through grad school, her goal was she wanted me to finish without student loans. So she did not want me to take out a loan. And she worked 2 jobs to support us throughout school. And we only had 1 car. So she was commuting to work while training as a marathoner. So I could take the car to the university. And I didn't understand this till years later, but like I was dealing with some of that anxiety I had in other areas of my life, in school and all these things, still through food. And we would get into fights over me spending money at school on food because she had us on a very tight budget. And it was a budget that was, it was realistic. We could do it. And the ultimate goal is we wanted to get out without loans. And so she was very adamant on that. And like, she's working hard in all these other areas. I was struggling and starting to suffocate, dealing with these emotions. I didn't really understand why. So I would end up buying these things to make it temporarily, like, quell that anxiety. That would lead to arguments or fights. And, something I didn't want to do. So that led to me starting to lie and hide those things, which is not a good thing
Right.
in a relationship.
Yeah. So the intimacy gets
Like,
eroded and
and
the trust.
I, I ultimately, I end up taking out a student loan privately that I didn't tell her about
Yeah, you did.
so that I
Of
could
course you
fund
did. Yeah.
like these purchases.
Now we're
And-
getting to the good part. Yeah, this is the shit I
and,
want to
like-
hear about. Okay.
So I could go out and like, have a binge or whatever it was.
Right.
And she didn't know about it because like I hated making her angry. That was the last thing I ever wanted to do. But I also didn't know how to not do these things.
Right.
Like there was some link where I was experiencing so much suffocation. The only thing I knew how to get through that was
The
to
hungry
engage
ghost
in
has to eat, and you're going to find a way.
Yep.
You're going to have to be crafty.
And then I would have so
Yeah.
much like guilt around what I just did or shame of lying to her. And so that
The only
like,
solution to that being either starving yourself or eating, right? Like, so it just, the vicious cycle perpetuates and you dig the hole deeper and
Yep.
deeper until you're alone in a dark room.
Yeah. So needless to say, she wasn't real happy when she found out about the
Yeah.
private loan. But then it was kind of like earlier, it's like, oh, I go on and like I somehow pieced it back together and things are okay and never really addressed it. Again, I think it was a pride thing and it was an embarrassment thing, acknowledging that I was struggling, like, and I didn't want to ask for help because I thought I could deal with it myself. I guess the next real big one was one of my compulsions with all the food related stuff was, the counting, so I have this obsessive thought that invades my head, causes an incredible amount of anxiety. So I then count to reassure myself that what I was afraid of isn't happening. And for years, that compulsion was more of a physical. I had to like add it up on my phone's calculator.
Mhm.
So I'd actually like just physically do that. And that actually started back in like 2004. Back when I was on a cross country trip with my coach. And I don't know if you remember these days, but like you had to pay per text message back then. Like, and like my coach was like, man, you're just blowing up.
data
Like
plan.
I was like, no,
Yeah.
like, yeah, kind of popular. But I was so mad at people when they texted me because like I didn't have the money to pay for each text. So like I was actually just adding up on my phone's calculator. I wasn't texting people, but like I played it off as I was just on my phone all the time. I was just texting. But there were times it's happened numerous, but where, I've almost wrecked my car because I'm adding up on the calculator because I can't not know where I am in the count. And the worst are if Lindsay's sleeping in the passenger seat.
Right.
Like, we're coming down Highway 50, a windy road through the mountains of Tahoe.
Mm-hmm.
She
You
wakes up, it's like,
crash
oh,
because you're like doing this weird OCD thing on your calculator.
I don't
want to
be doing
you
it,
can't
but
put down while you're driving.
I could
Yeah,
not
I
know.
understand.
Like,
That's the powerlessness part of it, right?
Yeah. And it makes you feel horrible. Like
And the unmanageability. Like, so you think you're just doing this thing and nobody should bother you about it. And it takes a while before you realize that the chaos that you're creating all around you.
Yeah. And then
it doesn't matter whether it's drugs or alcohol or gambling or relationships or whatever, shopping.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like you say, replace X. And there are similar themes probably through a lot of this stuff.
Yeah.
Like, and then I found actually through therapy, starting to open up and talk about things also was hard because that made me realize how the things I would say about myself were hurting other people. Because obviously, if I'm saying these things about me, I'm judging others indirectly through those types of comments. Like you said, like I am a athletic built dude. Like if I think I have weight to lose, what does that say about you? Like, so like there's that like reflective piece that was really also hard because I always thought it was just, I'm dealing with myself and what I'm struggling with, but it's actually hurting other
The
people.
judgment that you have towards everybody else as
Which
well.
it's a fascinating
And
thing.
nobody's judging, but nobody's judging you that way. Certainly
No.
not the way you're judging yourself.
And I didn't find myself judging other people the way I judged myself.
Of course not.
And I think that's the secret. Like no one actually cares. We all think
Yeah,
everyone's
yeah.
looking at us. No one is. Like no one's actually paying attention to you.
Just reflect for a moment
Like-
on your own level of self-obsession.
Yeah.
And just realize like, even if they took year 10 and you tune it down to 5, people are just still walking around thinking about themselves.
Yeah.
So like, relax, dude.
Yeah. And I think that's an important
Mhm.
like turning point in anyone when you're struggling with something is that acknowledging that. And I poke fun at Lindsay all the time on this, and she'll just kind of rouse me and say, "You're not special," And it's like, it's true, I'm not special. Like
Yeah.
we all have something going on. Like we internalize
But that's
it.
the other addict thing, the sense of terminal uniqueness. You have no idea how
This is different.
how different I am and how complicated and special my problems are, and you'll never understand. And I can't ever talk about it with anybody because they wouldn't understand. And it's not until you're in that recovery process and you realize, like, the person you're working with or the community that you're sharing with, like, they're all like, yeah, of course, duh. Like, it's exactly, the facts of your story are going to be different from the other person, but the thoughts and the emotions and the feelings are exactly the same.
And this is something I hope does change, is just resources for eating disorders or OCD improve and are more readily available. Because in some of those periods that I was describing when Lindsay was away at school, I considered attending AA because I couldn't find a support group. Like I couldn't find anyone to talk to. But in a small community like Mammoth, I was terrified that I would know every single person in that meeting. And some of them would be my patients. And the meeting was held in our clinic in the conference room. And so it was like too incestual that I didn't. And then there was that sense of like, well, I don't deal with alcohol. Like I can't show up there. That's not respectful to other people. But there, I was seeking someone to hopefully give me tools to work with, and then eventually it led to actually getting therapy one-on-one. But in this country, that's very cost prohibitive for a lot of people. And it's challenging.
Yeah. I mean, if I was secretary of that AA meeting, I would have let you in.
Thank you.
I would have given you permission to.
Yeah.
But yeah, so it is a weird thing, and that's why it's anonymous, right? There's the stigma and the fear and the self-judgment and the fear of others judging you, and how does that reflect? When it's in your clinic where you work, like it's close to home, it's scary. So was it just a dawning realization, like, okay, I have to deal with this. How am I going to deal with it? Or was there like a bottom where something bad happened and you're like, okay, like Lindsay's like, pack your bags, dude, or get help, or how did it kind of go down?
Thankfully, that never happened. But I think it was more that realization that I don't see a future living this way in my head. Just getting through moments in a day or an entire day was so exhausting. It was hard to imagine actually being a partner to her. Like, definitely we would never have kids. Like, we would never have a dog. Like, I couldn't handle any of that stuff. And I think that started to scare me, that I didn't want to be around, basically. Like, so there wasn't like a particular moment or an action, but I saw where it was heading. And around those same, in 2017, when she was away, we had a close friend. He had lost his life to suicide. And then I'd lost a few friends to the mountains. And I think there was this compounding thing of like the fragility of life, where I had a pretty privileged life and I didn't lose anyone other than some grandparents, that I started to really kind of like sit with how fragile this existence is. And I think that really started to scare me, that I didn't trust myself in terms of like knowing I can't live this way. And so that was the impetus to finally, seek out and start treatment. And Lindsay was very encouraging of that. I did cancel multiple my first visits because a combination of that, still shame, like being embarrassed that I would have to talk to someone about it. And then also in the small community, my therapist was downstairs from my clinic. And in the waiting room were my patients.
You're going to see the guy in the bathroom?
So I'd go in and the mental health services were with orthopedics. So I would be in the waiting room and patient X, what are you doing here, Tim? I'm like, oh, I'm checking up on you. I'd spin some story. And there was a lot of that just like embarrassment and shame, where it probably took me almost 2 years before I actually told people in the waiting room, oh, I'm here for myself. Like I no longer had that story.
It's so interesting that the help that you found was literally downstairs from where you worked the whole time.
Yeah.
And you could have gone to inpatient somewhere. You could have gone to a treatment center or something like that. But you found it in your own building all along. And that's been your recovery modality ever since?
It's been the main one. I mean, there are times where I want or still want to go to like an inpatient facility, but I think there's part of my brain is like, no, you don't need that, or like, oh, that's too expensive, and like worried about all these other, collateral things. But what I realized is like, so it's been over 3 years now. I think the first, and so actually this is, I think, important. Like I was very resistant to trying medication. Like it was another one of those like, well, that's not me. Like I had some internal stigma around it, even though I never passed that on to my patients. Like when I learned they were taking meds, like, because it's therapeutic, there are reasons why you might take a med. But 3 months ago, I started fluoxetine, which is an SSRI. And I was resistant for probably 2 years. And the nice thing is my therapist never pushed it, just said, hey, these are tools that are available, but let's try these things. And, just if we might need to. And when it was maybe kind of suggested, I was very hands off on it. But I think that for me personally, really stalled a lot of my progress, because in the last 3 months since starting this, I've actually been able to start to think a little clearer, because like this like cloud of, we'll call it cloud of counting, was so dense. I would go through a therapy session like every week, and I'd leave feeling like I just gotten out of church camp, I'm filled with the Spirit. I'm going to go preach to everyone. And then like 5 minutes later, I had forgotten it and reality struck me in the face. And I just was in this kind of cycle of
back to the loop,
back into it. And I eventually kind of connected with, okay, maybe that component of like the compulsive behavior, or the behaviors, is preventing me from actually getting into these other things. So I would say I'm very grateful for where I'm at now, but I know there's still a lot to be done, because I immediately just fall back into, the old patterns. Like I was at I was in Spain 10 days ago for a race. And like, I almost derailed my entire like build up because of a trigger that shouldn't trigger me anymore, and so it highlighted that, hey, you're still in this vulnerable state where your quiver is getting more robust. And like, I'm very proud of that, but I need to refine that and continue to work on it. And it seems it has to be like a daily practice.
Yeah. I mean, you're 3 years in, on some level, that's early recovery, right? And you speak about it very eloquently, and you have a grasp on the condition and how it's impacted you and the way forward. But the brain and its rewiring takes a little bit longer, and those triggers don't go away. The recovery is about noticing them as they arise, and having that extra moment to not act on them and to take a contrary action. And to the extent that the SSRI can function as a pattern interrupt or be, another tool in that quiver, there's nothing wrong with that. But it's probably good that you didn't do it right away. Like because then you can sort of just divest well, I'm taking this drug, I've dealt with it or whatever, but to shoulder the responsibility for your own recovery and realize that, you're 3 years in, and this is still, it's like you're not over it. Yeah. Like this is something you live with, and you develop these tools, and those tools become rote and routine, but they need to be practiced. And because in that dark, lonely room, that disorder is doing its push-ups, so to speak, and just waiting for a vulnerable moment to leap.
Yeah. And I think that parallel with sport is really impactful, where I didn't get here overnight, and I cannot run it as quickly. Just like we didn't get to these levels of achievement overnight. It took year after year after season of building, and it became a habit. And so, I think recovery is a habit. You have to continually practice it. And like you said, flex that muscle and get it stronger, and be kind with yourself when you mess up. And that's something I am not good about. And I don't think a lot of people are, is that self-compassion. Like the things we say to ourselves are horrible, and you would never say that out loud. Like I don't even tell my therapist the things I say to myself, but like, how do we, like, you can't live that way. You have to be compassionate towards yourself. Yeah.
That's a tough one. Like, what are the tools that you practice to get over that piece? Because I struggle with that.
Just acknowledging that something is, and trying not to place judgment on it, good or bad. Like, okay, I overate today. that happened. Like, that doesn't inherently mean it was bad. Like, but I have to accept it. I don't have to like what happened, but I can acknowledge that I'm human, that did occur, and what am I going to do next? And not get hung up on, that good, because
revelations.
Yeah, it's exactly. Careful there. Because no amount of guilt will ever change the past, and no amount of anxiety can shape the future. You really need to kind of bring it back into that present moment, and that's where I'm kind of starting to realize, like, I'm relearning all these things. Like, I still don't trust myself with food. Like, I'm relearning my relationship with it, but in that, I'm also relearning like what it is to have fun. It's almost being like a kid again in terms of like all these new experiences of like, oh, like having a meal where you're not thinking about every micronutrient or macronutrient that's in your food and counting and being worried about all these things off in the future or what you just ate, like, and actually listening to someone talk is a pretty cool thing. Like being truly immersed in a conversation and present. Like, I mean, I think you facilitate like this really nice space, because I don't know how long we've been going, but I haven't counted once. Like, that's
good.
Like, I was counting this morning. I was worried about coming in and seeing you because like I haven't been running much. It's been a week off from my race, so all these things and I think that's part of that compassion thing is like thoughts are automatic. You
right.
can't
And that's
control
huge
them.
progress. That's huge progress if you can sit and have a meal and not be doing the thing that you've done for decades obsessively and compulsively and get to the other end of the meal and realize you didn't do it. That's like massive progress. So I'm interested in the experience of going into a grocery store or entering a restaurant. Like what was going on in your mind previously in terms of the foods that would find their way into, like what you're thinking about when you're pushing the cart down the aisles then versus like what it's like now, and how, because you got to eat, right?
You gotta eat.
And you're still trying to, perform as an athlete. Like all of those are triggers that you can't avoid in your life.
No.
You have to confront them and find new strategies. So that's really tricky.
The short answer is I fell into the cost, convenience, and comfort choices. Like, what could give me the fix the quickest? And that's normally something high sugar, high fat that I can just devour. Takes no prep. So it's processed foods, and again, like this is one of those, like, I curated this notion that like I'm the donut guy. Like, I love donuts, and I do, but like
how Scott Fauble is the burrito guy.
Like donuts and dirt were my thing, like, and that is something that I still like, but a donut is great. A dozen donuts is excessive, like probably for anyone. So I think with the food stuff, I didn't know how to control. And there were times where like binges have a very clear diagnostic kind of criterion, but like the uncontrolled, kind of consumption would occur a lot. And it kind of just felt powerless. So one of the, strategies was just elimination, try and like keep things out of sight or out of our house. And the unfortunate thing, like you said, like as an athlete, you have to train, so you have to fuel. And this is where I'm thankful that, my bout with anorexia was in college. And over the last decade plus, it's been more of this, like I said, the OSFED, the other specified feeding and eating disorder, where it's kind of like a mashup of a lot of different components. Because if I was still actually restricting to the point of weight loss, I would be perpetually injured. And as a distance runner, you have no career if you're continually injured. And that's where, other people that have suffered, or they suffered long enough in that critical time period of their adolescence or early 20s, their bone density could permanently be damaged. I feel grateful that I didn't have that occur, because I've never thought of myself as talented, but actually my biggest superpower is my durability. So like, I've hated myself for never being thin enough or skinny enough.
But the durability
has allowed me to
in having a little more, meat on your bones.
And I'm doing this bones. 20 years later without injury because of that durability. And so that was never a deficit. But I think, acknowledging, our inadequacies aren't things that make us less of less worthy of acceptance or love. But you should celebrate that. But I ended up using running as really a mask to hide behind, where if I lost my control around food or a meal or events, I knew I had this secret weapon. I could just go out and
Go out
run
and
4,
train.
5, 6
Yeah.
hours without eating or drinking.
Right.
And I also would chalk it up to, I'm working on fat adaptation.
Yeah. I
I
heard Killian talking
I'm
about
getting
how
better
he
at
would
this.
go like all day and like, so this is what
Yep.
we're supposed to be doing.
Yeah. So,
Yeah.
but then when you do that every day or every big training block, that's not how it's
Mhm.
done. Like, you have to be selective and you have to be thoughtful and really precise and recognize that the recovery is important. Where if I went out and ran for 5 hours without food or water, I wouldn't come home and then eat everything. I was in that euphoric state
Yeah.
and I would not recover the way I should have. And I don't think any of this stuff, like I'm not of the belief that had I figured this out, I would have been a better performer. I just think I would have been happier throughout my entire career.
Mm.
And I do think there would have been more consistent performances. Like, I could have avoided a lot of the huge pitfalls, failures, or blowups I had, because a lot of those were mental or physical, because I wasn't treating my body well. I wasn't nourishing it. And that is hard because I'm in it to perform,
Right.
and it has real life consequences of, like, you can lose your job
Right.
if you don't perform.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah. I mean, yeah, exactly. So there are, amazing pressures on top of all of this
Mhm.
outside of just, how you're interacting with your peers at work and your partner at home. We're like an hour and a half into this. We haven't even talked about running. It's like, we should probably point
told you
out that like
I
Tim's
told you I
pretty
can
good at
run.
running. Yeah. Like,
or I can run my mouth.
You have this, you're kind of like average in high school, you go to college, you start having some success, you take your shot at marathoning. I think you're like a 2:18 PR marathoner, two-time Olympic trials qualifier, but recognizing you're not going to kind of get to that next, super elite level. You find the trail world, you have success. I think your first ultra, you won the 50K US championships.
Mhm.
That's true. So like right out of the gate, distinguished, Nike contract, and then UTMB in 2017 was that was your top race, right? When you got third?
Yeah, I got third in 2016 as well.
Right. But you were, that was 22 hours. And
Yeah.
then
Yeah.
the following year, under 20. So the world is looking very bright. Everybody's looking at you, the next big thing. And you win a lot of races after that, tons of races, but you couldn't quite recapture some of those, high highs or whatever. You've had, some disappointing results over the years. And I'm sure a lot of that is wed to everything that we've been talking about today. So I'm interested not so much in going back and rehashing old stuff, but how you're thinking about your training and your racing now. I heard you say at some point that a big part of your motivation came from a place of anger, and certainly in recovery, that's got to be replaced with something better and more sustainable. So what does that look like for you now? Like, it's got to be a totally different relationship with the thing that you do professionally.
It is. And to what we spoke about earlier, like thinking that maybe these things I battled were actually a superpower, there's been that fear of letting it go. And then when you pair it with subpar performances, you start to connect those dots and think, oh yeah, it's because you're not doing these things anymore.
Sure.
Like, and
it would be so easy to go back and do that. Yeah.
And like, I have to fight that thought, but I always remind myself of how lonely and isolating and unhappy I was in those moments. Even when outwardly I was having success, like I was pretty empty and there was never going to be enough. So like, if I had won UTMB in one of those years, I honestly think it would have been worse because I would have doubled down on everything because that was pre-starting therapy. I think my life would have really struggled as a result. If everything I basically am afraid of then was amplified to an 11 because of that, success or notoriety, I would have completely crumbled. But I think some of what I'm really working on is making sure I acknowledge that, okay, I am very proud of the steps I'm taking in terms of recovery and separating that from my performances. So just because, the last couple of years, I've had some pretty tough breaks on the biggest stage at Western States and at UTMB. And it would be easy to say, okay, you're past your prime, you're washed up, or you just don't have it anymore. Or linking it, okay, it's because I'm not doing these things. But I'm confident that I just have had a string of bad luck, and that's the sport. Ultra running is hard. Like, unless you're Courtney or Jim,
right.
and I always wanted to be that, but I have to acknowledge I'm human. Like, I'm of this earth. And the reality is I'm going to lose 99% of the events I line up for. But I still hold on to that one big dream that I'll eventually get it. And that's what keeps me showing up. And starting to see that, like, my individual success doesn't have to be the top of the podium. Like, there's so many ways for me to achieve like my best result, even letting go of what other people do, which is hard.
Yeah, one of the things that I got out of the Koros doc, which also chronicled you running Western States, was the fact that even though you had a disappointing result, you were kind of fast out of the gate, things didn't go quite as you planned, that there was a joy and a sense of connection and like community that was really buoyant for you and very different from reaching the heights of being on the podium at UTMB and going under 20 hours. Like, even though the result wasn't what you wanted, the lived experience of that was somehow more meaningful and important.
For sure. And that was, I think the community part was huge, because in the past, I've always prided myself on this lone wolf mentality, which is laughable because no one does anything alone. We always have help from the moment we're born to any achievement, but there's something that, is this like, self-made athlete or X or entrepreneur or whatever it is. And like that I can do it alone, and asking for help is a weakness, or asking for help shows that like vulnerability is something I shouldn't, lean into. And so I think with that first experience with States, and even last year, I, welcoming my inner crew and actually letting them in to help me, it was so much more powerful and meaningful, because I do feel like we created something more beautiful as a result for having been broken and then coming out the other side than if I had just knocked it out of the park. And what was fascinating is the amount of people that reached out afterwards and like shared their stories or wanted to connect because I hadn't given up on myself and I finished, was far more reaching than if I had won the race. And I think that was another important reminder that people aren't going to remember the races you won or the records you set or the IPOs you hit and like all these things. It's more like, hey, how did you make them feel? How did you connect on that personal level? What were you able to do together as a community? And that's something I'm really trying to lean into, which is hard because I'm still afraid of people's opinions. Like I can't shake that fully. Like, I still find myself doing body checks and all these things, but I'm getting better at confronting it and letting that anxiety kind of course through me and realize that my fears aren't matching reality. And then it starts to like almost feel like, okay, that demon's starting to like, become more of a whisper.
Yeah, that's really beautifully put. I mean, the antidote to the isolation and the habitat in which the disease can really, kind of linger is community, right? Like being with people, being transparent and open and vulnerable and trusting, letting people in. Like, so much of it is just like allowing yourself to open the door to those people who already want to help you, who've been waiting for you the whole time and are finally grateful and thankful that you're giving them that opportunity. And it's hard when you're stuck in that desperate cycle, but you've walked through that. And what I love is that now, like, recognizing that and realizing that that is not only important, but maybe that's the whole thing. You end up starting this trail series, which is really just like an entrepreneurial external manifestation of your recognition of how important it is to cultivate community and share the things that you love. And now, like, you're doing that. So it's one thing to just say, oh, I'm going to start a race series or start a race. But here it's like, it's so wed to your recovery in a really beautiful and authentic way.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Cool. It was terrifying also. Have you ever seen that documentary Fire Festival?
Yes.
I was 100% convinced they were going to like do a docuseries on Trailfest.
How bad?
And it was going to be like people out in the woods.
Well, it's kind of like, just because you're a trail runner doesn't mean that you can be a race director and create a race. It's sort of like an actor in a movie thinking they can write, direct, and produce, or, like you compete at UTMB. That's like a guy who shows up to do 2 days on, the Avengers movie where there's a million moving pieces, and thinking, well, I can do this, right?
Yeah.
And then going and making your little indie movie, right? But you're, you're on the second, you have the second one coming up? How many?
Yeah. It'll be our second one this September. And yeah, it was an amazing experience. And I definitely credit all the people involved that helped make it happen. All my local partners in Mammoth, and, it was beautiful. But I think what I've really recognized is, as much as a kid, I dreamt of being that superstar sports athlete, naming the stars, kind of like, being a professional. I think it's a common dream for a lot of kids.
You are a professional. You know that, right? Okay.
It
wouldn't matter how, if you had beaten Francois and Killian, there'd still be somebody else. You would never feel like you actually achieved that height that you had set for yourself.
Yeah, that's true. Touche.
But go ahead. Sorry.
No. And I think what I've recognized, though, is the impact I really want to have on the sport or a community is giving other people those opportunities. And I learned from so many people that came before me, like reading their blogs, talking to them. And I know that the next generation of trail runners are going to supersede anything Killian, Francois, myself, Courtney, Rory, any of those people have done. And I hope that we just facilitate and give them opportunities and help foster them to achieve those things with a little bit less of the sidestepping that we may have occurred, because they're going to, encounter some, kind of fork in the road, and they're going to struggle. But hopefully they can learn from these experiences and recognize, hey, you don't need to change your body to meet sport. Through training, your body will adapt to what you're doing if you're nurturing it and taking care of it and providing, love to it. And I think the ultimate act of self-compassion would be to fuel your body properly, and to actually recover. But I think those are the types of things that led me into Trailfest, where I see it as an opportunity to have a platform to welcome people to the majestic place of Mammoth, which is absolutely stunning. Like it's a beautiful place in California, and allow them the opportunity to then go have this kind of self-discovery in a majestic place with a very supportive community. Last year was amazing. We had a woman from the Midwest. She showed up, had never been on a mountain in her life. She said that she had just heard me talking on a podcast and thought it was a good idea, so she signed up. And she finished her first ultra.
Wow. Cool.
We had a guy from Florida. He was training on a treadmill with an oxygen mask, and when he crossed the line, he wept in my arms. He was just couldn't believe what he had just done. And I think that's the type of stuff that really fills me up, where I want to share those experiences with people. And what I told all of our runners last year was, this is going to be hard. You will suffer. That's life, right? There's no way of avoiding suffering. But what better place than in a supportive community like this, where if you do stumble, if you do fall, if you fail to make the cutoff, we're going to pick you back up. You're going to be okay. You're going to have an amazing weekend learning, watching, being inspired by other people. And then hopefully that excites you to go do another race somewhere.
Right.
Or get other people out there.
Removing the veneer of intimidation from the thing that's already intimidating, and creating a welcome environment for all comers.
I've had periods where I've definitely thought my life would be healthier without running, which is a strange thing to say, because inherently running is not bad. Running is an amazing gift to have, but my relationship with it was so kind of skewed and twisted that it was leading to unhealthy behaviors and experiences. But running has also changed my life in so many positive ways, and that's what I want to share with other people. And I am all about the community, but I also love competition. I'm still that athlete, and I'm not I recognize that we need and that is my job. I didn't perform for a couple of years, and I basically was at risk of losing my job, and that's a hard thing to swallow. But I think there's that both and, you can celebrate the top level competition and strive for big, audacious goals, and foster community, individual wins, and recognize that we all can have something to better ourselves as a result, even if you didn't top the podium.
Well, not only are those two ands not mutually exclusive, they feed each other, because I think the more that you serve this community of people through the series that you've created, the more fulfilled you'll become. And it will just make you feel more whole and a better version of yourself to approach the competitive side with the races that you're competing in. I mean, what is that like? Like, does that, you're still competitive, you're in the game, like, how are you thinking about like the big races that are coming up? Like, what's on the calendar, and what is your relationship to the buildup and your, how you're imagining your participation in them versus what it was like a couple of years ago?
It's definitely shifted where, as you said, for a while, anger drove me. And there have been times where I think, can I even perform if I'm not angry, or if I don't have that, like, built up, doubt that I'm trying to prove everyone wrong. And I think there are, and this might be, that big question, what is your why? Like in life and sport, I think whys shift, they change. And mine has definitely been shifting and changing. And I think I've recognized I don't need that anger or that doubt or that insecurity to drive my good performances. I need to lean more into that community, that love, that self-acceptance. And that's going to allow me to self-actualize. And I do understand that that's a bit, maybe, it's kind of a privilege and indulgent to be able to like be at that place. But I'm really thankful, like, especially right now, like I switched sponsors this year. Right. And that was hard. To be honest, I thought I was going to grow old with Hoka. Like, I thought it was going to be, I was going to retire, and we had a long-standing relationship. But several years of underperforming, like, it caught up to me, and that's the reality of sport. And I have a great relationship with everyone there. I just saw him a couple of weeks ago at a race, and saw my manager and marketing director. And and I understood that. And going back to earlier, I had some friends that top of their game, Meb, loses his sponsorship, then he goes on to win the Olympic trials, medal at the Olympics, win New York he won Boston. And so it was hard though, recognizing that, like, hey, I'm no longer valued, but that was business, and my goals, my dreams, and what I believe I'm capable of are still there. And that's where I'm really thankful, with Kraft coming in. When I started talking to them, it really reminded me of like my early days talking with, the co-founders of Hoka. And they're excited about the sport. They're kind of creating this misfit group of athletes and inspiring people that want to change the game, from the footwear to the stories we tell to the ways we engage with the community. I mean, the way they stood by Tommy was unbelievable.
Yeah,
like,
it's amazing.
It just like, it reminded me that, hey, these are the people I want to surround myself with. And they, most importantly, believed in me. They said, hey, we don't think you're done. We just think you've had a tough string. And that's really what I've leaned into, is my inner community, with the brand and with our team and myself and my therapist and, everyone that's in my circle, of recognizing I still have these big goals. I know what it takes to, achieve them. And I'm working towards that. And I don't have to have this false sense of humility anymore. Like, for a while, I thought it was bad to say I wanted to win UTMB. So like, I'd skirt it and say, I'm just out here to have fun. I'm going to, enjoy the vistas. And the reality is, you wouldn't do this type of training, put in the hours, see like year after year, or, destroy your body through the Alps if something wasn't driving you. And it's okay to want to win, but I'm separating that. Like, I don't need to win anymore to complete myself as a person, but I want to win, and I'm training with intention to win. And I believe I can win and that I will win, but I don't need that to validate myself anymore. Right. And I think I've never been able to authentically say that. I may have said it, but I didn't believe it. Like, I still thought my acceptance and love was contingent on achievement or something external, where, and as you said, there's never enough. Like,
that's massive growth. I mean, in this evolution of your why and how you define your why and what motivates you as you pivot away from these old behaviors and patterns that don't serve you into this, different, more, nourishing way that involves the trail series and the community and like understanding that you don't have to earn love and all of that. Like you don't get the dopamine hits that like anger is going to give you or these other spikes that, you've come to rely on over the years and have like mistakenly associated with performance. But what you're doing is building a really solid foundation for a healthier approach to being a competitive athlete, and you are taking out an insurance policy on your longevity, but it takes a while to build that foundation, right? So you haven't emerged from the foundation stage yet to actually show people what you're capable of, which I think makes it a very exciting time for you.
And that's where it would have been really easy to default, where dropped out of UTMB the last 2 years again. Like last year I had COVID. Finally caught me after 2.5 years.
I'm going to mindfully relapse into my food, idiocy, just so I can extract this one performance and make sure that I'm holding on to these sponsors. And then I'll go back to the recovery stuff.
And then it'll be fine. And I'm really proud that I didn't do that. And I think it's just that affirming and a reminder that just because you do everything right doesn't mean you're actually going to get the outcome you wanted. Like life isn't fair. Like you're not going to get what you deserve, but you keep showing up. You keep trying, you keep giving the effort. And at some point, I am a believer that things will work out in a positive way, but you have to go through a lot of shit to get there, and that's where I love that saying. I think it came from Vanilla Sky, the sweet is never as sweet without the sour. And it's like, we all have sour in our life, and instead of trying to numb that sour, let it fuel you into something else. Because once you get the sweet, it's going to be really good.
It's still a pretty new sport, right? And there's been a lot of growing pains and, it's sort of emerging out of this phase of dirtbaggery into like real money. And, we saw Ironman take over UTMB and like, these are big changes and I'm sure not everyone's happy about them. But they're a reflection of growing interest in the sport, more people participating in them, money coming in, sponsor, like all of this stuff, right? It's and meanwhile, athletes getting more and more sophisticated and savvy about how to race and train. So prior, or in maybe the flight or the generation that preceded yours, there were a lot of people who would come. They would arrive on the scene and they would just destroy everybody and be unbelievable, and then would be completely unable to ever replicate those performances and are never to be heard from again. Only a couple outliers had any type of longevity in the sport. Now we see, there's Killian and Courtney, people like that. I'm interested in why you think they're so good or so much better than everyone else, but what are you learning about what's required to have that kind of longevity or to maintain an elite level of performance over the course of, a respectable amount of time as opposed to a flash in the pan? And also, as a kind of side note to that, we saw what happened with Anton Krupicka, right? Like he was the dude, gone forever, back, like had an incredible performance last year. Like that's very cool. Like I think that, just because maybe, to your point, like you've had a downturn, there's still sweet to be mined on the other side of sour.
Yep. In any endurance endeavor or sport, I feel that the patient will ultimately be rewarded. Like it's consistency is key. That is the underappreciated skill set in endurance. Like it's about stacking hours, season after season, year after year, and keep showing up. I talked to a close friend one time and I said, or he kind of asked a similar thing, like, what sets people apart? And my response was, it's hard to beat someone when they don't know when to stop showing up. Like, is that like Rocky Balboa? Like you just
it's true in anything.
Like you got to grind.
Right.
And I think that's something I really hope to do in our sport is set the next generation up to have more consistency and have the ability to not only self-actualize, but avoid burnout. And so if we can do that collectively as a community, I think we will have won. So that if your kids want to get into ultra running. They know that the healthy way to do that is to nurture their body, or if they want to get into marathon or sport or anything, don't try to manipulate your body to mirror some idealistic version you've seen of X, because you don't know what's actually behind that. If someone was modeling me, they were modeling after a very sick, unhealthy person, and I wouldn't want that to happen. So I hope that we change those conversations. And then I think through that discourse and discussion, we can get more people to basically adhere to, the values and norms that are going to allow for healthy, relationship with a sport. And that's going to just trickle down into all aspects and make the community stronger. I think that's probably, going to be the most important thing. And you mentioned the, big players coming in and kind of, maybe changing, the face of the sport, and that's happening. Change is hard. Growth does not come easy. I remember back in school, undergrad, we had to read this book, Omnivore's Dilemma.
Sure.
And yeah, you would know, right? You know a little bit about nutrition. And I believe he talks about our choices, we vote with our dollars, vote with our choices. And I feel like the same is true for our community and sport. People are always going to show up and support, purchase, and align themselves with people and brands and companies they share similar values. And we have collectively a lot of power to do that. And I think our group of trail runners can do that. So if we don't like things are going a certain way, we just can make those choices on our own. But I think that I am excited to see where it goes, because as we get more opportunities for athletes, I think we're going to see, even more transcendent performances. We're going to get more Courtneys and Jims out there in the next generation as we make trail running cool.
It's inevitable. In the same way, if you look over the history of Ironman or triathlon, the people that would win were people who were really good at one of the three. Yeah. And if you happen to be good at two of the three, you were beyond, so you would be, a marathon runner or a collegiate track and field athlete could do well. Now you have to be unbelievable at all three. And that's not a guarantee of anything. And now in the world of ultra running, we're seeing you, Walmsley, people that are Olympic trials qualifiers in marathon going into trail running. You're only going to see more and more elite performers, especially when the money comes in. It's if you're an elite track and field athlete or marathoner, why are you going to fuck around in the trail world when there's no money and you could just get hurt or whatever? There's too much risk involved. But, that's changing. And I think it's only going to attract a higher caliber of athlete, and who's approaching it, not from, I eat granola bars and do whatever, to being very precise and intentional about what they're doing.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of room for growth here.
Oh, for sure.
So,
that's where I feel lucky that I came up when I did, because if I had been this athlete, and this goes back to even high school, I wasn't recruited out of high school to go to college. I walked on. I wasn't an All-American in college. I left without that accolade that every collegiate athlete wants. But I kept going, and I just didn't give up on myself. But I think with the sport, and I was fortunate because when I was in high school, we aren't where we are 20 years later in such good guidance for high school kids. The level of training they're getting is next level. And we're going to see that in trail running. If I'd come up into trail running 10 years from now, I couldn't have gotten away with all the shit I did with starving myself and not treating my body well. And I hope that people recognize that the only way to really self-actualize or get the best out of yourself is to do these things properly. No shortcuts. It's not, there aren't any hacks out there that are going to get you there. A hack is the quickest way to get you on the injury list. You're going to end up with stress fractures, whole host of things. And there are times where I wonder, was all of that abuse I did to my body over the last 15 years, is it finally catching up on me? It's maybe. And if that's the case, I had a good run, and I'm not gonna let that deter me from what I want to do next. But I'm confident that isn't the case. I think that is my superpower, is the durability, and I just have been fortunate to have messed up so many times and still had second chances. So that's kind of how I get it.
Yeah, I get it. I think you're describing if I starve myself or do this thing that I know is not in my long-term best interest, but probably will help me short-term.
It's the short-term games we get hooked up on.
And when you're like young and you're a gunner and that race is everything, you'll take that bargain every time. And I'm sure tons of athletes do that. It's like, who cares? Like,
in every sport,
I'll deal with the whatever, my bone density, 10 years from now. I don't care about that. What I care about is what's going to happen in 6 weeks.
Yeah.
So it's really hard to overcome that, especially with, younger people who have a hard time thinking long-term about anything. Like, these are decisions that, start to make sense when you're in the twilight of your career and you're trying to, keep going, right?
We're in that rocking chair moment where we can just like reflect on everything.
Yeah.
But that's where, like, in the social media age, we are rewarded with instant gratification. So like not undoing, but like acknowledging that's one path, not the only path, and learning to pleasure delay, I think is really important to instill with anybody in any endeavor. Like, because that's where the greatest, benefit's going to come.
Sure.
Is if you can display some emotional control to then at some point reap the rewards.
Mm-hmm. And I think a good way to I want to close this with a little bit of guidance and help for either people who are in the midst of suffering from some version of what you've gone through and the alarm bells are going off in their minds because they're relating to what you have to share, or people who have people in their life that they are confused around how to best help them, and for the teachers and the coaches and the parents to understand how to look out for this and what the warning signs are. So if you're a basketball coach or a track and field coach, or you're a seventh grade teacher, or you're a parent whose kids are now adolescents and you're noticing, hey, this thing around food doesn't look quite so right. Like, what have you learned about what to look out for? And once you have a sense that maybe something might be awry, like, how do you navigate that? How do you address that with that person? How, what is the way? And this is obviously there's no easy way to answer this, but I'm sure there's a lot of people out there who are like, I know this person needs help. I don't know how to help them. What should I do? That's another 2-hour podcast. We could go. We spent hours on this.
I think Lindsay was out walking.
Like 8 questions.
I'm good. I got my coffee still. I think it's important to let people know that you love them. Like, that's at the heart of it. Like, you are there. You love them, for who they are. You aren't going to be the one responsible to fix someone. And that's what I think a lot of us try to do, is we want to be the fixer. And in reality, with anyone that might be suffering from something, like, they need to autonomously make that decision to seek help or get treatment. But you need to show that you support them, not enable them, but support them. And I think then it's about collaboratively reaching out to people that are the professionals. So if you're a coach and you see this kind of behavior starting in someone that you're worried about, I think bringing in a professional to help would be good. Getting, the school psychologist or the nutritionist, I think it's important to really not approach people as you're doing something wrong. You need to come to them like from a place of love and let them know that, hey, like, we're worried about this, and let's, talk about what's going on. Because I think conversation is the root of everything. Like, I wish I had been strong enough to have conversations with people when I was growing up or in college, or with Lindsay early on. Like, a myriad of reasons I didn't, but I think not talking allowed me to basically build unchecked narratives in my head that just ruminated, got deeper, the roots got deeper, and eventually, like, it just, started to strangle everything.
But talking and conversation also aren't light switches. You didn't grow up in a household where you learned how to do that, or where that was modeled or practiced. So if there isn't a habit or a practice or an environment where trust and kind of open dialogue is already kind of in place, that takes a lot of time to build and establish. You can't just, come to somebody who's not used to that and say, it's time to talk, and expect that person to be open with you.
Yeah, no, not at all. And I think that's where you just have to approach like all these conversations or people kind of with the grace of recognizing, meet them where they are. Don't expect a quick fix. It's not a light switch. We're dealing with dimmer switches. It's going to be a slow up and down. And that's the thing with recovery, is we expect it to be linear, and it's anything but, right? Like, I'm sure you have felt that, or and it's very circuitous, and what we think it looks like is, this A to B, vertical line, or, going up on the graph, but it's just convoluted. It's messed up. And being kind to yourself or others when they aren't making the progress we expect, because each person's time frame is going to be different. But I think it's probably important. But yeah, having the conversations is not going to be easy, and that's the hardest thing. Like, I've seen people suffer, and I can't reach out to talk to them because I'm afraid I don't have the right words.
Mhm.
And I think that's what prevents a lot of us from doing a lot of things, is the fear of not having the right thing to say. And sometimes just being there or saying something is what someone needs to hear.
Mm.
I think, I don't know. I really try to tell myself, like, stop measuring and start living. Life's too short to count all your Cheerios.
Mhm.
It's like you really need to get out of that model and realize that, the beauty that is in life is if you're actually in the game. Like, you can't just be a spectator in your own life and like window shop while everyone else is feasting on, I don't know, the goods of what being alive is. And I think, anyone that might be suffering or has questions, like, just know that the ultimate act of courage would be just to talk to someone, like, and it's never going to be as bad as you
Mhm.
think it is.
Mhm.
Like we said, no one's watching us. Like, no one, well, people might be watching us on YouTube right now, but it's, no one cares the way we care,
Mhm.
you know?
I think that's very well said. Yeah. I mean, obviously, certainly, if you're listening or watching to this and you're having a sense that maybe you need to talk to somebody about your own behavior, it would be absolutely key to reach out to somebody you trust, somebody who you feel will receive you with grace and not judgment. I mean, the judgment piece, I think, is huge, but you're not going to be able to solve the problem in your head,
Hmm.
despite what you think. And it's not going to go away because you're pushing it down. The only solution is going to come by raising your hand, inviting people in, and not only asking for help, but receiving that help when people offer to help you.
Hmm.
And that is much harder than trying to, grit your teeth and
Yeah.
figure it out yourself.
Yeah.
Because, well, if I figure it out myself, then I don't have to tell anybody about
Yeah.
it, right? That's the thing. And I think if you're somebody who's bearing witness to somebody suffering, whether you're a parent or a friend or a colleague or a teacher or a coach, it can be very confusing
Mhm.
because if you don't have any personal familiarity with this,
Mhm.
it defies logic. Why can't they just fix this? Or
Yeah.
why don't they stop doing that thing? Can't they see? And I can see what they need to do and they can't. And so with that, like when you're kind of thinking of it in that context, when you approach that person, you're going to be coming at them like pretty aggressively or with a lot of judgment or confusion. And that's going to put that person on their heels
Mhm.
and defensive. So you got to find a way to broach it in a compassionate way, um, by draining it of any judgment and just coming at it with love and curiosity. And to your point, like not being codependent, I'm not here to
Mhm.
like enable you.
Yep.
I'm not going to keep your secret. And, maybe I can't even be your friend right now, but like when you're ready, I love you. And when you're ready for help, like I want me to be your first call. Like
Mhm.
and it's hard, man.
It is.
Like
And
when people who care about the people who are
yeah.
suffering, they're suffering themselves and they can't help that person unless they're taking care of themselves. So, whether it's Al-Anon or finding their own community with people who have, navigated that same thing, I think becomes really key.
That's spot on. And I love what you said. It's that like non-judgmental awareness of the
Mhm.
situation. Like, you don't have to place judgment on what they're
You
doing.
could say, I don't even need you to stop. I'm not telling you to stop.
No,
I'm just saying,
exactly.
like, I know what's up
Yeah,
here. Yeah.
exactly. Like, and because
yeah.
that's going to disarm people. Like,
Mhm.
all of us are conditioned where if you come in, I'm going to immediately like, be resistant and, lie my way out of something, because there is that shame component that you're wrapped up in,
Mhm.
and that will lead you to do things you don't want to do. But I think that, coming in with that non-judgmental kind of awareness of the situation, and then also educating yourself. I think a lot of that, the misconception of what OCD or eating disorders are, like with OCD, it's like, oh, I'm compulsive. Like, like I like
Mhm.
to arrange my pens certain ways. And like, so it kind of gets maybe reduced into like something that's more like a personality trait versus like an
Mm.
actual disorder. And I think just educating ourselves on, no, this is something that's actually leading people to suffer. Like it's intrusive, it's unwelcomed, and it's debilitating
And progressive.
and progressive. Like, and what we said earlier, if you think about anorexia nervosa, which is one of the major eating disorders, has the highest rate of mortality out of any mental health like illness. That's scary. Like, so it's not just oh yeah, we all overeat or we all have like problems with food. It's like, yes, that's true, but let's educate ourselves that some people really are suffering. And I think that's the important piece where like, then we can come to them with compassion. It's not just, oh yeah, like I don't like how my legs look in the mirror or, how my shirt fit today. Like, cause all those are true. And I think it's just recognizing that, okay, like this is a serious thing and not to reduce, like, belittle it, or, kind of reduce it in your mind. I think that's a huge step because then the person that's suffering will feel a little more welcomed that, okay, like you actually understand, it's not like, oh yeah, like I count my calories. It's like, well, did you count 300 times today? Yeah. Like, did you?
I'll win that game. Like, you want to go to war over like this?
Yeah.
Like, yeah.
So it's kind of like, but it's all a spectrum. And I loved what you said earlier. It's like, it's about us managing our feelings and our triggers because we're not going to live in a world. And I don't want a world where everyone's tiptoeing around and like, they can't say certain things. We should all be respectful, but I need to manage myself in the world that's an open environment that people are going to say, do, and act in different ways. And I can't expect them to always like coddle me.
Right.
Yeah.
Tim, is it okay if I eat in front of you?
Exactly. Yeah. Like, so it's about like finding that balance point, but like just being respectful of where people are.
Yeah. And understand that it's a disorder. It's a disease. It's not the person. Like decoupling the identity or that person from the behavior, I think is really important. And realizing that it's a coping strategy born out of a feeling of being less than or out of control or being incapable of giving yourself the level of self-love that we all deserve, right? And that recovery is that journey towards self-acceptance and self-love as the antidote to that darkness.
And it can feel like I'm broken, I'm the thing that's wrong, not acknowledging that, oh, I do have this illness. And it's kind of like the computer is glitching. We don't just throw the computer away. Like you upload the software better, you just like give it a patch. And it's like, we just got to like, kind of work on the, how we're dealing with things. But I think that prevents people from asking for help or mentioning because it feels like they're broken.
If you knew just how bad I am and how broken I am and how beyond repair the situation is, like that's the mentality.
And it's, I mean, I'll be honest, letting go of the reassurance-seeking behavior is very scary. Like I've had times where I don't know where I am in the world. It's so unsettling because I'm trying to actively fight whatever behavior was going to reassure me that it was okay. And that's a terrifying thing. So it's like you're caught in this massive storm out in the ocean and you had this shitty little life raft and like arm floaties and you were terrified, but you felt some sort of comfort with your little raft and your arm floaties compared to when you have the calm open sea and you're all alone and there's nothing else there.
Yeah.
Like,
what am I
that's
supposed
scarier.
to do with all this like serenity?
I'd rather have the noise in my head and like grip on white knuckling these little things than that. But eventually you recognize that the calmness and the serenity is a state you can live in and trust. But as you said, it's going to take time. And also it's going to take resources. And it's not easy like to get those resources. Like when I left my job as a full-time therapist, I lost my health insurance. So the best thing for me to deal with some of these anxiety-inducing things was leaving that full-time employment. And by doing so, I lost access to my healthcare.
Right. You couldn't pay for the recovery resources that you needed. Yeah.
Which, that was a shame.
That's fucked up.
Like, that sucked. Like, and I mean, again, I'm at a place where, I mean, I had two other careers going, a pro athlete and a race director, like, building something. So I was really like burning myself out with three things, just filling the void. But it shouldn't be that way. I wish we had access to resources that, because people are struggling. Like, and it's always going to be that way. But there is, like you said, everything is impermanent. And there was something I came across in in my recovery is the term wabi-sabi. And it's this Japanese philosophy taken from nature that everything is impermanent, imperfect, and incomplete. And I think it's a beautiful way to kind of look at ourselves, our situations, the world. Things are imperfect. They are, impermanent. It will pass. And we know that in ultras. You could be in the lowest low you've ever had, and somehow you went 70 more miles after that because you didn't give in yet. It'll pass. But then it's also incomplete. Like our recoveries aren't complete. Our careers, our relationships. And I think just like me leaning into that and accepting that, like someone that wanted control on everything, someone that like was tied up in like perfectionism and thinking that that was the way to, salvation or, being loved or accepted, and recognize that everything is impermanent, imperfect, and incomplete. Like it helped me kind of like start to like settle in to the muck and just be like, oh, okay, like I can live with that. Like, because I'm chasing this figment of something that doesn't exist. It's theoretical perfection.
Right. You've convinced yourself it's real, but it doesn't exist. Yeah, it is an
it's like a math problem, like
anyway.
Yeah. So
and there's a relief in that.
Yeah.
But also discomfort.
And that's what we like to numb ourselves, Rich. Like but I have really learned, and I continue to remind myself that like learning to let go is far more powerful than holding on. And that's not easy, but I'm trying to let go of more and more things and trust.
And that's a very counterintuitive edict in and of itself, but to tell a hard driving, very competitive athlete or business person or just ambitious person in general, that the better way is in the surrender and the letting go. You might as well be speaking, Mongolian.
Yeah.
Like it just doesn't, it's like, what are you talking about?
Yeah.
Like the whole reason I'm here and what fuels me is my ability to like double down on that self-will and hold on even more tightly and push. So the subtlety or the kind of being in that state where you're untethering yourself from results and, floating in that calm body of water is like, it's like being on Mars. Like that is not, that it takes a long time to really understand what that means and to grok the fact that it's not about like giving up.
Yeah.
It's just tapping into a more powerful and more sustainable fuel source that not only will lead you exactly towards the same things that you're ambitious about, although your goals may change, you may be ready for that. But also, you'll be able to do it with joy and with others and all of these things that you have decided are indulgences or distractions.
Totally. And I think that was key. What you said is you don't have to like it. Like, it's that like acknowledging the radical acceptance idea of, hey, this is what's occurring. You don't have to like it, but what are you going to do about it? What's that next step? And I think that's where people get stuck sometimes. Well,
that's why, the universe is wired to, create these bottoms. So you can have these reckonings and these realizations, which are gifts, right?
Yeah.
Like, so you crashed into the wall and now you're on the other side and you're like, oh my God. And now we're talking about it. But the fact that somebody listening to this might be struck and short of hitting their own bottom is going to say, I'm going to do that. Like, that's unlikely. It's probably not going to happen. You have to, it's an experiential thing. You might have to suffer a certain kind of pain that's different than the pain you suffer when you're running an ultra marathon, a psychic pain, a spiritual, emotional pain. And those tend to be levers and motivators to do things a different way.
For sure. Without a doubt. Like, and I think you're spot on. Like you have to go through that resistance. And I don't know, thinking about running 100 miles through the Alps doesn't seem as scary or daunting as like living with your own thoughts when you're like really in that.
Right.
Like,
which is the source of all of man's suffering, of course. His inability to sit alone for 5 minutes with his own thoughts.
We're going to fill that void with something.
I'm going to go like the suffering in the mountains is really just an elaborate distraction from having to sit alone with yourself for a couple minutes.
And how often do people now take their phone or their podcast or whatever while, a lot of people will be on their run or their bike listening to this? And something I've actually done that I think is really great for where I'm at is I've unplugged when I go run. No more stimulus. I was almost using that. I forgot what running felt like because I was there was always something I was trying to get out of it, outside of, and I was just overstimulating. And I went for a run and I literally was just listening to my breath, my footfalls, the birds. And it reminded me of me as a kid running. It's that's what I love about running. Moving through space quickly, kind of feeling effortless and floating. And you described the flow state just a little bit ago, letting everything go, letting go of the control, not thinking, getting rid of that analysis by paralysis. That's where you're going to produce your best work, whatever it is. If you're an artist or an athlete or if you're in medicine or I feel like you do have to let go of that control, stop thinking and trust the process.
Well, to be continued, man. I can't wait to see what you're gonna manifest and do. I'm excited about the trail series. I'm excited about the performances on the horizon. But more than anything, just this message that you're carrying has a very kind of important vibration to it. You're an amazing, vehicle to speak about this thing. And my goal for this podcast, really, honestly, is to just make more people aware of what you went through so others don't have to. And for that message to ripple out and transcend beyond the trail community to a larger, population of people. Because I do think, as I said at the outset, it's important when men speak up about this, because I do think that there are just so many men out there who are suffering in silence with this because there isn't a culture of permissiveness around talking about it. So I applaud you for the courage and the vulnerability that you've demonstrated in kind of shouldering the responsibility, in a public service announcement way, to talk about this stuff. So it was really cool, and I appreciate your openness, man.
Thank you.
Yeah, cheers.
And thanks for sharing those stories, because it makes a difference. Someone out there will hear one of your podcasts and it'll save them. So, yeah.
We'll see, man. All I do is I put it out there and then it's up to them, right?
Yeah.
I'm surrendering. I am surrendering this podcast to the world, Tim.
Wait, can we do the peace?
We're going to do it. We're not there yet. This was my big opportunity.
Oh, did I jump the gun?
Yeah. His is I'm going to softball. I'm tossing you the softball for the plug. Where do you want? You're on Instagram. You got the, what are the URLs? Where do you want people to go?
Yeah.
I'm sure people are going to want to learn more about the Mammoth Trail series in September. So where can they find out more about that?
MammothTrailFest.com would be it. It's pretty cool. We have over 1,000 people signed up for this year, and there aren't too many spots left. So if anyone's interested in joining, they should get on it.
Jump on it.
And someday I'll learn how to do thoughtful merch. But right now we don't really have much.
But swag, but you got up your. We don't do that either. We probably should do that. It's do people really want coffee mugs? I guess they do, as I take a sip out of my branded coffee mug that I can't sell because this is the only one we have.
But I would just encourage people, if they were interested, and they aren't going to run, just come join the party. We're looking for what we're terming the Sierra Soiree. It's just going to be this big gathering of our community at the end of September before the snow hits the Sierra. And if you can't make it, go out to one of your local trail events, volunteer, join in, just see how powerful it is watching people overcome, their doubts, their fears, these incredible, endurance feats. And just go be part of it. I think it's going to make all of us a little bit better. So, I would really just encourage people to get out there and join the trail community. It's the best place in the world. So
cool, man.
Yeah.
Right on.
Thank you.
Thanks again for sharing. I'm going to let you now. Here it is. You do it. You take it.
Peace, plants.